Well, I've been looking through the threads regarding Descartes and your conversations therein. Very pleased, by the way, with what you're doing. I think you're doing some really good work. You're asking some very good questions. But I've noticed that there's a little bit of confusion with regard to the way in which Descartes is using his methodological skepticism and the radical doubt that it has that it employs, and in particular, the relationship that this skepticism has to relativism. So what I'd like to do here is give you a little mini lecture that tries to address some of the things I see coming up here. And in particular, what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk a little bit about what exactly relativism is. So I want to say a bit about what it is philosophically. I'd like to say something about what warrants it philosophically, why it is that someone would see this as a good idea. I'd like to talk about some of the philosophical problems with it. And then I'd like to talk about skepticism, what it is, how a little bit about its history and how Descartes uses it, and then finally the relationship of skepticism to relativism, because I'm not sure it quite plays out in the way that it seems to me a number of you are taking it, and I'd like to try to correct that if at all possible. Okay, so that's what we'll do. Well, relativism has to do with truth, if nothing else. And this is part of what makes it such a problematic issue. You see, on the one hand, truth has to do with something that is beyond us. Truth has to do with what is the case. And presumably there is a world beyond the realm of our own imagination and experience and thinking and thought and consciousness, right? At the same time, whatever there is to know about this world is something that we don't have access to except through our own experience, through our own mind, through our own consciousness. Relativism is the disposition toward the nature of truth such that it may be established as dependent upon the mind establishing that truth. That is to say, that truth depends upon the mind that is thinking about that truth in order to be true. Now, this is an idea that is, I suppose, a little bit mind-bending in some ways, because it's a way of putting one's own mind at the center of the universe, but it is not a new idea. And I want to make it clear, since some of you seem to be under the impression with what I've said about modernism, that this is an idea that starts with Descartes. It doesn't start with Descartes. Relativism is a very old idea. We can see, certainly in the Western tradition, we see it playing its part, amongst other things, with a group of ancient Greek philosophers called the Sophists. And in fact, there's one very famous sophist, a guy named Protagoras, who coined the phrase, "Man is the measure of all things." And we have taken that as, in some ways, one of the standards, one of the measures by which we would think about what relativism is since then. Suffice to say that relativism is not something that only Descartes or the early modern thinkers are dealing with. This is something that ancient Greek thinkers were dealing with, Roman thinkers were dealing with, medieval thinkers were dealing with, early modern thinkers, late modern thinkers, and people today. Everybody's thinking about this. It's a common problem, and again, it's a problem because of the way in which we approach truth. One more thing I should say about this as far as explaining what relativism is. And this is, I want to mention this because of the way in which I've seen it discussed in the threads. I've noticed that you guys have been talking about relativism in terms of ethics and relativism in terms of epistemology as though they're the same thing. Well, it's certainly true that relativism in ethics, that is, the idea that the truth of ethical values seems in some sense to depend upon the person making the evaluation, and the truth of epistemology, that is to say, what we know as being true depends upon the person doing the knowing, are related to one another. But I think it's pretty important to realize that as far as this discussion goes, and as far as what we're looking at, the weight of the relativism we're dealing with is epistemological. Descartes didn't really deal with ethical relativism at all, except insofar as perhaps it might be implied by epistemological relativism. For the most part, the questions that he's asking have to do with how do I know that there is anything to know about the world other than what I am knowing? How do I deal with that? How do I correct myself, and how do I make my ideas clear? And how do I get beyond my own thinking? So it's epistemological relativism that we're dealing with, right? Not ethical relativism. I suppose in a pluralistic society such as ours, it is not hard to see then why relativism would be a relatively popular idea. It certainly gives you something to hold on to epistemologically when you have the multitudes of your fellow citizens, or at least inhabitants, having their own opinions and dispositions towards things. But that in itself is probably not an adequate philosophical answer. I mean, just because it gives you a way of being clear in your own experiences in the midst of the experiences of others, it doesn't really explain why philosophically you would want to take a relativistic position. What is it that warrants relativism? What is it that gives it its legitimacy? Well, I think there's a lot of ways to answer this. I know there's a lot of ways to answer this. There have been a number of different philosophers who have talked about this over the ages, and actually in a lot of different philosophical traditions. But I will bring up two that are relatively consistent, perhaps even ubiquitous with regard to this idea, and they're pretty closely related to one another. The first is this idea of the privacy or the subjectivity of the mind. What I mean by this is that whatever it is that I understand in my mind, I understand uniquely unto myself. The ideas that I hold, the understandings that I hold, and indeed the beliefs and values that I hold within a complex organic system. My mind, just like your mind, is a network of values, of beliefs, of all these different ways of looking at things, of reasons. It's a nexus, right? I mean, you can almost see this physically. The brain is organized that way, and just as the brain seems to be organized that way, so it is that our mind seems to proceed that way. It's a unique organization, a unique combination. Indeed, it's a unique event of ideas that are proceeding in a certain way. Now, given that that's the case, when I understand something in a certain way, I have to understand it as I understand it. I have to understand it uniquely. I have to understand it as Seth. I have to understand it in the mind that is Seth, right? Given that that's the case, given that my understanding is uniquely mine and always mine, and that's what I've got to evaluate truth with, right? That's what I'm going to be using because we've already laid that out. That's what I've got as far as truth goes. Why would I not think that all truth is relative to that measurement, provided I recognize the subjectivity of that measurement? In other words, given that everything that I know as true has always been in relation to the way in which I have been able to hold truth within my mind, why should I not make myself the standard by which truth is measured? Privacy, subjectivity of experience. This is one of the reasons for relativism. And it's a good reason for relativism. You should notice that. There is one challenge to this. Well, there's several challenges, but there's one rather constant challenge that's given to this, and that is to say, well, yeah, maybe it's the case that you come to understand aspects of truth in the world through yourself, but the way that you encounter the world, what you learn about the world, what you experience about the world, what you reckon about the world, all these different things, these come from things that are being imported from outside of you and imposed upon you, most notably in terms of other people. I mean, think about what you've learned, people, so the argument goes. Think about how you learned how to speak. Think about the different aspects of the world that you've learned about. Things that you haven't necessarily ever experienced directly, or that wouldn't have occurred to you on your own, but are things that you have kind of come to and thought about and realized because someone introduced them to. Like, for instance, Descartes, right? Doesn't that suggest that there is more to the truth of the world than just what you are doing in the mind that is you? Well, there's a response to this too, and the response has to do with the idea of discreteness. Just as it's the case that I am privately and subjectively me, and I hold my ideas uniquely in my mind, so it is that I cannot express my knowledge to you as mine. So I have all sorts of ideas. Heck, I'm teaching this class right now, and we're going to be talking about Descartes and Voltaire and Hume and Kant. We're going to be talking about all these things. And I'm the teacher of this class, and since I'm the teacher of the class, I presumably have some sort of understanding about these ideas, and part of my job, why I'm getting that big fat paycheck from Linfield, is to impart that to you, right? Well, I hate to tell this to Linfield, but I am incapable of doing that job. I am epistemologically and ontologically incapable of doing it. And you know why? It's because of this. Because I can't take the understanding that is part of the organism of my mind, right? Part of this network, and implant it in you. Sure, I can try to indicate it to you. That's what I'm doing right now. That's why I'm doing uh, this little podcast iMovie PowerPoint deal that I'm doing here. But while I'm trying to indicate these ideas to you, I can't actually take them out of my understanding and place them in the mind that is you. Your mind is your mind. My mind is my mind. And I don't know how they could possibly meet, because they are what they are by virtue of their own internal organization. There is, in other words, a very, very deep ontological discreteness to the nature of my knowledge. My knowledge is entirely dependent upon, organized upon myself. And I can't ever get to something outside of it in order to judge it, to standardize it, to evaluate it. There is no triangulation in the realm of thinking. And this is one of the great problems that we face when dealing with our understanding. It is one of the issues that we face when we look at just how warranted is the idea of relativism. And so, it seems that the way that the mind holds knowledge has to promote a certain degree of relativism. That relativism is part of the way in which we have to understand things, if for no other reason than the fact that we can't ever understand them perfectly, it seems, and that we have to understand them from a certain point of view, and uh, and with a sense that we're always trying to figure these things out. I guess that perhaps relativism is, at least a little relativism, is in some sense inevitable here. And it leads us to wonder, well, maybe we should just accept some degree of relativism. I mean, maybe this is something that has to do with part of our thinking. Maybe it's natural. Maybe it explains part of the way the world is. If it is indeed natural to our situation, why should we consider it a problem at all? This is the great question. Well, if relativism is in fact as inevitable as it is for the human mind, that there is a certain way in which everything that we evaluate as true is always going to be contingent upon and dependent upon us, as the scope of a swath is to a fulcrum, why do we need to worry about it? Why not simply accept it as part of human life? Well, I think it's because as much as some element of relativism is inherent in human epistemology, there is something that's pushing against it that's very important and very significant to our understanding of the world. And what it is that truth has to have to do with something other than us. Truth must be real. That is to say that it seems one of the central meanings of truth is that it refers to a real world that's outside of us in some way, that's external to us in some way. And given that that's the case, if we try to reduce truth to simply our own internal activities, our own internal mechanisms and machinations, there's a way that what we understand is going to be profoundly compromised. It's true, as it were, that relativism is always going to be there. But as much as it's going to be there, if it dominates our epistemological scene, if it dominates the way in which we understand things, it's going to create a real problem for the way in which we understand anything at all. The reason why it's going to get in the way of our understanding in general is that the effect of relativism is that it compromises the nature of truth that we supposedly ground knowledge and reality from that upon, right? That even if we are able to use the power of reason to understand something as right or correct, so that even if we can deduce that 2 plus 2 equals 4, even if we can deduce that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, even if that in itself is all correct, if it doesn't have to do with anything other than the activities of our mind, there's a certain way in which that is empty. Our knowledge, in other words, our what we know about the world, the way in which our mental life engages with and encounters the external structures of the world and tries to understand that, tries to acclimate our consciousness to that, requires us to have some sort of reality beyond ourselves. And if we don't have that, whatever we establish, whatever we know, becomes empty. Knowledge becomes empty with relativism because relativism reduces what we can know to the scope of what we can verify in being ourselves. That is its great problem. That is the great issue that it has to overcome. Now, this great issue, such as it is, can be quite daunting, even intimidating. And that being the case, quite often when people recognize this, when they recognize what it is that relativism brings epistemologically to the situation, they're often inclined to move in the opposite direction. They move to embrace something that is 180 degrees different from this. In this case, absolutism. Absolutism is the idea that there are truths that are true and meaningful regardless of understanding, regardless of how we take it, regardless of its place in our mind. So that from an absolutist point of view, something is presented to you. It may make sense. It may make no sense, but its truth is not dependent upon whether it makes sense or doesn't make sense to you. Its truth is simply given, and you are required to accept it. Now, it's not hard to see this is the position that's taken by religious zealots and political ideologues, right, of all different stripes. And it's a position that people often take precisely because they feel the threat of relativism. They feel this threat in which they can't begin to grasp what this truth is that they're trying to deal with, and so they simply absolve themselves from it entirely and say, all right, there's a truth, I'm going to accept it from this authority that is outside of me, I'm going to take it, it's going to be the case, and that is so, right? And they seem to do this because they assume that embracing the opposite of what they take to be the opposite of relativism is a way to solve the problem, the emptiness of relativism. But here's the cruel joke that comes out of that. The knowledge that you get from an absolutist epistemology is still empty. It's still empty because, quite honestly, there's no aspect of you relating to the world. I mean, in the case of relativism, the problem is you don't relate to the world because it's all about you. In the case of absolutism, there's a situation in which you don't relate to the world because it's all about the world. But knowledge and understanding has to do with you bringing consciousness to the world, touching the world, as it were, mentally, engaging the world, coming to find something about what's real in the world and acclimating one's mind in some way to that. How do you do that? Clearly, it can't be done simply with relativism, as much as relativism might seem obvious from an immediate point of view. Clearly, it can't be done from the point of view of absolutism, even though absolutism might seem like a refuge from a particular point of view. What are we supposed to do? Enter skepticism. So, what is skepticism? Well, skepticism is it's actually a word that derives from the Greek skepsis. It means inquiry. And unlike relativism, it doesn't speak to a disposition about the way in which you think about knowledge. Instead, skepticism is a methodology. It's a methodology that tries to question the necessary conditions by which an idea might be arrived at. So in essence, it's looking at what it is that makes it possible for an idea to be sustained rationally or logically, right? It is not, and I really want to make this clear, it is not something that is meant to be an attack. It is not meant to be something that is betrayal. It is not meant to be something that is undercutting. Sometimes I see skepticism as being interpreted that in a couple of places in the threads. I think largely because of its association with the word doubt. But the thing to realize is that doubt, at least on an epistemological level, doesn't have to do with this undercutting. It's simply a way of asking what are the basic tenets, what are the basic conditions that make it possible for an idea to be held. Skepticism is simply a method for treating this knowledge. It has nothing to do with the disposition we hold towards the knowledge or the way in which we regard the state of the knowledge, right? This is an important point. Another thing to realize about skepticism is that it is old. Like relativism, this is something that doesn't just simply begin with the modern period. This is something that is part of the classical world, the ancient world. It's imbued within Greek philosophy. There's actually there's not only a school of skeptics, there's different schools of skeptics. There's the Pyrrhonistic skeptics, there's the academic skeptics, and these different schools of skepticism, of inquiry, go over hundreds of years and proceed sometimes in contrast with one another and in contrast to other minor schools. Also, it's important to realize that this skepticism was not something that was limited to the Greek world. Actually, there's a great deal of evidence that the very earliest of the Greek skeptics got their ideas from India. Pyrrho of Elis, who was alive in the middle of the 4th century and was sort of sharpening his intellectual teeth at the time, is reported by a number of historians to have traveled to India and studied with different wise men there and developed his methods of skepticism from there. Even more than that, you can just see from the trade routes that there was a great deal of interaction between India, between Greece, and from that even Eurasia, sort of Central Asia, and even China. Suffice to say, it's an old idea. It's skepticism is not something that's limited to Descartes. It's not something that's limited to the early modern period. Really, the reason why it picks up at this time is because of a kind of because of a kind of rediscovery that's going on in the 16th and 17th centuries. Descartes wasn't the first of the early modern thinkers to apply and use and really be enchanted by the methodologies of skepticism. Actually, probably the most famous figure to do that would be Michel Montaigne, who is, amongst other things, the person who we get the word essays from, a word which originally means weighings. I don't know if you knew that or not, but an essay is a weighing of something. But Cartesian thought, Descartes' thinking, and his employment of skepticism is part of this movement in the 16th and the 17th centuries, the early modern tendency to rediscover the powers of this skepticism as far as human understanding goes. I guess the other thing I would want to put forward as far as skepticism goes is that it's multifaceted, that it's used in a lot of different ways, and it's used for a lot of different purposes. Now, the reason that I'm telling you this is it's because of what I'm seeing with regard to the way that you guys are talking about Descartes' discussion of God, and in particular with your concern or interest in his use of the idea of God as a deceiver. The thing to realize here is that skepticism is not, it really hasn't been since its early uses in the ancient world, and certainly isn't with Descartes. It's not something that's meant to question loyalty or necessarily even authority. What it is a way of trying to understand what the rationale is that sustains a way of justifying a particular position, right? That's what it does. It's true that when we look at a skeptical inquiry into a particular idea, that quite often people in positions of power begin to be, I don't know, uncomfortable. And I suppose they have a reason to do that. The reason that they become uncomfortable is because they're uncomfortable with the idea that their rationale is going for whatever it is that they are doing, whatever it is that they're exerting power over, is going to be questioned, right? Perhaps it won't hold muster. Perhaps it's not as watertight or rationally legitimate as they would like to represent. But the thing is that skepticism doesn't raise these questions to undercut authority in and of itself. It raises these questions in order to understand the nature of this authority. And so, when we look at Descartes being skeptical about the idea of God, when we look at Descartes raising the question of whether or not God is a deceiver, he is not doing this in an irreligious way. He is not doing this to challenge the church, although I suppose it could be taken that way. Rather, what he is doing, and this is important to understand, what he is doing is he is using the power of reason to try to inquire how it would be possible for that thing which is the clearest and distinctest idea, the condition for the possibility of perfection, which we've already established in Descartes, right? How it would be possible for that to deceive us in our understanding of what it is that makes it possible for the world to be the world. How it is that that could deceive us in our use, our imperfect use, of reason with regard to trying to understand the world. That's what we're looking at. Suffice to say that when Descartes uses skepticism, he is not being relativistic. He is not trying to be relativistic. Skepticism, as we shall see in a moment, can be quite constructive, not necessarily destructive. And indeed, it can be constructive in our understanding towards those most basic ideas, those most clear and distinct ideas from Descartes' point of view, namely God. Epistemologically, what can we say about the relationship between skepticism and relativism? Well, on one hand, it does seem like skepticism seems to promote relativism. The obvious way that it does this is that it points out to us very quickly just how unwarranted so many of our everyday beliefs are. There are all sorts of things that we just take to be the case, take to be facts, take to be true, take to be unquestioningly true. And the only reason we take them to be true is because we've never taken the time to investigate the rationale behind them. They've worked. They've continued to be the case, and that's all we've ever really asked of them, and so we hold them to be true. When we bring skepticism into the fore, we discover that these things that we've held to be true aren't necessarily true. And if it's the case that that was what connected us to an outside world, I mean, if we hadn't really done very much to connect ourselves to the outside world, well, then all of a sudden, it seems like the outside world is very, very far away. Even more than that, there's a certain way in which skepticism brings to the front of our mind how much a lot of what we had taken as a kind of understanding isn't understanding at all. That it's a kind of belief, that it's a kind of opinion, sometimes that it's a kind of fantasy or deep sort of unconscious desire that we just hold to be the case. Things that are, with a little bit of investigation, quite obvious, but are completely hidden from us until we take the time to investigate it, right? So skepticism, I guess, takes us towards relativism in the sense that it disillusions our illusions, and in doing so makes us realize how much of what we had thought was the quote-unquote real world is really just our own imagination, was generated and created by us. I guess one more thing too that comes up with skepticism as far as promoting relativism is that it makes it clear just how hard it is to really get to a point where you understand what reality is. We would like to think that we can investigate the world and through our capacity of observation and analysis see it for exactly what it is. That we can say, yes, this is the case, no, this is not the case. We can give it a particular number, we can give it a particular evaluation or categorization. It's reassuring to us. It gives us a sense of power, I think. And actually, a lot of you guys have mentioned this in your introductions when you were thinking about philosophy. You were talking about how trepidatious you were about taking on a philosophy class, that you were accountants or you were used to concrete thinking, and what was right and what was wrong. And skepticism, one of the basic tools in the philosopher's toolkit, well, it undoes this, doesn't it? It makes it very hard because it makes you realize just how hard it is to say that you really know what something is. I mean, even if you're very confident of it, even if you're very comfortable with it, that by no means is any way to be sure that you actually know what something is. It seems, in other words, like skepticism inevitably, as a method, brings us closer to relativism. But obviously that's not what Descartes thought. Actually, Descartes thought of skepticism as a kind of antidote to relativism. Not a cure, it doesn't solve the problem of relativism, but you can see very early on in the meditations, and what motivates the meditations is a desire to overcome this idea that each person's position represents the truth. He seems to think that skepticism can get us over this hump, that it can get us over this relativism, can get us through this relativism. And one of the questions we have to ask is, how does it do that? Well, the most obvious way, and certainly the way that Descartes, and not just Descartes, but a lot of his contemporaries too, Michel Montaigne, from whom the word essay comes from, Thomas Hobbes, a lot of these thinkers, the way that they tried to do this they tried to use skepticism to bring us to a more epistemologically solid ground. They tried to bring us to a point where when we asserted that something could be known, it could be known absolutely categorically, that regardless of the way that you came at it, there was no way that reason could assail it. Now, I really want to bring this up. I really want to emphasize this because I think this is something that's been misunderstood in the threads. I look at the way that you guys have been approaching this stuff, and one of the things that I see is a lot of people taking skepticism as a way of doubting the veracity or even the trustworthiness or authority of a person. I guess sometimes that can be a side effect of skepticism, but that is not what skepticism is about. Skepticism is about trying to account for what the fundamental reasons, warrants are for holding a position, and then not holding that position unless those warrants have been met. That's what we're trying to get to with this, right? So that skepticism brings us to a point not where we've doubted everything away and there's nothing to believe in anymore, but more where whatever is left when we stopped being skeptical, we know is solid, is grounded. Perhaps it's not perfect. Perhaps it's still subject to doubt, but we know where it lies in relation to things. And it puts us in a much, much stronger position epistemologically.